Hello guys, and today we're going to look at our third assessment question. So far we've done the very hardest one, the 20-mark essay, or the 16 marks with 4 marks for spelling and grammar. We've done the 8-mark writing account, and we have 2 left. Now both these final questions involve sources. So really what we do today will also really inform next week's lesson on source questions, and both of them involve quite similar skills, although one of them is slightly harder than the other. So we're going to do the easier one today, and then next week we can build on everything we learned this week, and we can do the slightly harder one with a little bit extra explanation. So there are 2 source questions. As I said, the first one, the one we're going to look at today, is easier. It's much shorter and it's only 4 marks. So you will spend 5 minutes on this question in your exam, and it's worth 4 marks. So if you just read it, it's this top one here. So study source A, and they'll give you a source to look at. Then it will say source A shows something, and I filled in the gap by saying shows the Americans encouraging aggression. How do you know? And that's it. And all you have to do, and we'll talk through it in much more detail, but quite simply, all you have to do is understand the source, pick out things from the source that show the perspective it's asking you, and just give some evidence to back it up. That's it, really simple. The slightly more difficult one is question 2. If I get out of the way, it's worth 12 marks, so quite a substantial body of the marks on this paper, and it will involve 2 sources. So your whole exam, this module of the exam, they'll give you 3 sources in your source pack. 1, 2, 3. Just to say right now, some of you were in that class, but that year 7 class I had, where when I said the word sources, you all just couldn't stop laughing because you thought of ketchup and barbecue sauce. No, we're not talking about sources like condiments. We're talking about sources like historical sources, primary, secondary, that kind of thing, okay? So none of that miscommunication. Right, the 12-mark question, what is it? I've written it up here for you, and I'll just read it out. So study source A and B, but it will be B and C. It might be H and F. They normally give you random letters. Don't really know why they don't do it A, B, C, but they do. But anyway, study source A and B. How useful are these to a historian studying opinions about the Marshall Plan? Explain your answer using A and B and your contextual knowledge. So when you do this one, you have to be able to look at the sources, pick out things from the sources, and back it up with evidence to say if it's useful or not. That's why this one's a little bit more tricky, okay? This is 12 marks, a bit more time in your exam. This one's only 4 marks, okay? So there's an overview of the 2 final questions we have to do, and then you've done every question in this exam paper, okay? Right, the first thing you have to do is obviously have a look at the source you've been given. So we're imagining we're going to be thinking about question 1, the 4-mark question, and I've got my source in front of me. So we need to think about what is going on here. Now for this 4-mark question, it will always be useful for you to read this bit up here. Now they'll give it to you underneath the source in the exam paper, and it might be a little bit more detailed than this one is right here, but we need to read it. This will tell us where the source has come from, when it was produced, what kind of topic it's talking about, and it's really helpful to contextualize the source for us. So in terms of this one, we know it's a cartoon, and it was published 2 days after the signing of NATO in 1949. Therefore, we know the source is going to be about NATO. In our head, we can contextualize it to think, okay, how does this reflect NATO? And that will really help us moving forwards. When we look at the source, there are some questions we need to ask. What does it tell us about the events? Where's it come from? What's the provenance? And then finally, if we're doing question 2, is it useful? But for this first question, we don't need to worry about much of that. We just need to think about, what is this source telling us? Okay, so I'm going to purposefully put my head in front of the answers so we can talk about it, and then I'll move out the way in case you wanted to make any notes from this. So, got my source here. I know it's about NATO. My question is asking about NATO, so I need to think, about what this tells us about NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which, as we know, formed as a defensive military alliance. So what can I see? Well, I can see that Stalin has been separated and isolated from all the leaders of Europe and the USA who are over here. I know that these are the men that joined NATO. I know that Stalin didn't join NATO, so that's why he's being isolated. They seem to be playing some kind of card game, which might suggest, you know, there's a level of conflict or competition between them. Maybe it's a game of chance. Maybe it's a game where they now feel like they've got the upper hand. And the leaders over here seem to be led by Truman here, right at the front. My hand keeps going funny. There we go. I've got it back. This guy here is Truman. They're led by him and they seem to have the upper hand. They're waiting to see what Stalin does next. Now, all of those things I've just picked out of the source by using my eyes. I've looked at it and I've thought, what can I see happening here? I can see he's sat apart. I can see he's isolated. I don't need to know anything about NATO to pick that out. I know this man over here is isolated, apart. I know they're playing a card game. I can see it. And I know from the writing up here that Stalin's go is next, that they've played their hand, okay? Now, because I'm, you know, super intelligent and love history so much, just like all of you, I know that actually fits with most of what I know about NATO, that they formed it first. They formed it because of what Stalin did in the Berlin blockade, and they do it to kind of provoke this reaction from him. What's he going to do next? How is he going to respond to this? Okay, so in my head, I already know that most of those things I saw with my eyes do make sense and fit with what I know of the historical period. So if we're answering question 1, this is all we really need to do. We need slightly more evidence to help us back it up, but really this is the only skill involved. So imagining our question said, source A shows the isolation of Stalin after NATO was signed. How do you know? Step 1 will be pick out your points. What can you see in the source? I can see these things. They all relate to the idea of his isolation. They all relate to the source. They're all using my eyes. They're not using my head, they're using my eyes. Okay, so the next thing you're probably wondering is, okay, what do I do with this? I have this information. I've seen what I know it can pick out of the source with my eyes. I've told you already you need to back it up with a tiny bit of evidence from your head. So how do we put it all together? What you could do to respond to the question, and I'm going to hide the cartoon rather than the answer so you can read it as I say it essentially, but this is basically how you would respond to this question. Now it's only 4 marks, so we want 2 identical parts, okay, to get a 2 and a 2. So you need, what can you see in the source and how can you back it up with evidence, times 1 for 2 marks. What can you see in the source, how can you back it up with evidence for the second time for 2 marks, add together to make 4. So this chunk here is essentially half the answer. Now, if I was writing that with my hand or with my computer on a whole line, this is only about 2 or 3 sentences long. So you can definitely write that in 2 to 3 minutes, and then you have 2 to 3 minutes for the second half, okay? So let me just read it out to you. Source A shows Stalin separated from the leaders of Europe. And this suggests he was isolated. My question asked about isolation. There we go. I've told you what I see in the source. It shows him separated. I've told you how it links to the question and isolation. Harry Truman is pictured at the head of the group of world leaders, which suggests that he has a body of support behind him in the conflict against Stalin. NATO had the support of 12 countries such as Great Britain, the USA, and Canada, and they all looked to America for leadership and military funding. Done. That's it. Okay, half of it explains what I can see. I can see that Stalin sat apart. I can see that he's isolated. I can see that Truman is at the head of all the other leaders and they're all against him. What do I know? Well, I know that 12 countries went to Truman as a leader of NATO. Done. At the bottom, I've just put my sentence starter for my second one, okay? And I would need to do 1 more. In addition, ... and you would do 1 more example, okay? Plus 1 more piece of evidence. So it's really, really not that tricky, this one, guys. What can you see? How do you support it with your head? Write it down, 2 parts, done. Okay, before I unleash you to have a go on your own, let's do one more example. This one is about the Korean War, okay? So it's a poster that was produced about the Korean War. So we need to have a look at it. And again, we're thinking, what does it mean? What does it show, okay? So I'm going to analyze what it shows us. So I'm going to go through in a moment my answers, how I would respond. What I suggest you do now, pause the video and try to do it for yourself as a practice. Pick out 3 or 4 bullet points that you would make about this source in terms of what it's showing you. So you need to look very carefully, you know, the hand, what does the hand represent? Who is the big character? Who is the small character? What are all these people around the edge doing? What's this phrase at the top saying? What's this wording down here saying? All of this together, what can you pick out about what you can see going on in this picture about UN intervention in Korea, okay? So you have a go, bullet point 3 things, and then I'll talk about mine and see if you were, you know, see if you were similar. Okay, so what did I get? I'll move out of the way so we can see. Right, looking at this picture, this is a bit of a nightmare, isn't it? Because I want to be able to point as well as talk. I'll go over this side. Looking at this picture, I've picked out that it shows the communist aggressor, who is the big character. Again, my hand is going funny. There we go, just about there. This character here, the communist aggressor beating up Korea. And Korea is this character on the floor. So it's almost like a big bully beating up a smaller child. It's like a year 11 beating up a year 7, okay? And obviously our compassion and the vulnerable party is Korea. And the person we think, you know, what are you doing? Pick on someone your own size is the communist aggressor. Now that makes sense in terms of our knowledge because Korea is a relatively small country in the world. Communism is spread all over the USSR and China, 2 very, very large countries. We know it's already kind of started to breach into Eastern Europe, and we know it's about to go into Asia. So the communist aggressor is much more powerful than just little Korea is on its own, okay? So that's number 1. Now, the other thing I noticed and I thought might help explain why the UN intervention is necessary is that all these countries around the edge are relatively small. So perhaps it's showing that these countries on their own are too weak and small to combat this communist aggressor. But the hand of the UN is big enough to take it on. So if the question that was being asked is why does this source justify UN intervention, I've now got for myself 2 very clear points that I've picked out with my eyes and eyes alone that I also know I have the knowledge to back up. So the UN hand is strong enough to take on the communist aggressor, but these countries are too small on their own. That's why we need the UN. And firstly, that the communist aggressor is beating up Korea and they are the stronger party, Korea is the weaker party, okay? And that's all you have to do. You just now have to put 2 small facts with it. So, you know, the idea of the communist aggressor, you can talk about how communism has spread all over the world by this point, and is much more dominant, the Chinese Revolution, much more powerful than just Korea on its own. And for the second point, the UN, you know, you could put the idea that these countries had to join defensive alliances, for example, NATO, because they don't have the strength on their own or the finances on their own to combat the USSR. So that's really it. Okay, so what I'm going to ask you to do today is this question, and I'm only expecting 1 4-mark answer. That's it. It will be 1 paragraph with a 2 and a 2. Okay, it will be what can you see? How do you back it up? Times 1 underneath. What can you see? How do you back it up? Times 2. Okay, eyes, head, done. This is your source. And this is your question. So the question is, source C supports the Truman Doctrine. How do you know? We've done the Truman Doctrine before. We've done the Truman Doctrine to the lengths of the earth, it feels like by now. We know what it is. It's the commitment to containment. Okay, now you need to have a look at this source. You need to think about what you can see. You might want to plan it out because it's the first time you've done this. You might want to start by listing some bullet points, picking out the best 2, and then thinking, how do you back it up? But I'm literally looking for 5 minutes of writing. I'll give you a clue when you approach this. Think about Stalin here. Stalin is pushing people into his van. Truman is welcoming people into his van. There are some certain countries that are lining up ready to go. Who are those countries? Why might they be portrayed making that choice? Think about the countries that have been pushed in the van. One of these bullet points should really be commenting on this idea of pushing. So why is Stalin pushing people? What does that tell us? And I'm sure you can do this really well.